After the Civil War, in the period known as Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed by Congress and sent to the states for their approval. They are often referred to as the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and formally outlawed slavery in the United States. The 15th Amendment guaranteed all men the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. The 14th Amendment was aimed at protecting the rights of the freed slaves in the South, and it addresses numerous aspects of citizenship and a citizen's rights. The phrase in the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws, is the most widely referenced phrase in legal actions and used in various landmark cases. Initially, the protections offered by the 14th Amendment were interpreted very narrowly by the Supreme Court. That was apparent in the slaughterhouse cases of 1873. This was the first judicial ruling on the 14th Amendment. The case began in 1869 when the state of Louisiana granted a monopoly to one company to slaughter animals around New Orleans. Independent butchers represented by John A. Campbell argued that the law violated the butchers' rights under the 14th Amendment because it deprived them of the privilege of operating a slaughterhouse and earning a living. Eventually, the case reached the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision written by Justice Miller, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment did not apply because the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applied only to the federal government and not state governments. In addition, the court said the independent butchers were not deprived of equal protection nor due process because they could still earn a living. At the end of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, there were numerous landmark Supreme Court decisions that further defined equal protection of the law. Plessy v. Ferguson was heard in 1896. The case involved the strict segregation laws of the Jim Crow era in the South. In 1890, Louisiana passed a law that established racially segregated railroad cars, one car for whites, another car for blacks. Homer Plessy, who was biracial, was arrested for sitting in a car reserved for white people. He was tried and found guilty of violating the law. Plessy challenged the conviction. The law, establishing separate railroad cars, he said, violated the 14th Amendment. Eventually, his case reached the Supreme Court in the case Plessy v. Ferguson. The court ruled that the Louisiana law did not violate the 14th Amendment, which it said applied only to political issues and not social issues. And the court said, as long as there were railroad cars for both races, even if they were separate, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was met, and so the policy of separate but equal was established. In 1942, the United States was at war with Nazi Germany and Japan. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt called for the exclusion and internment of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast by signing Executive Order 9066. Fred Korematsu, an American-born citizen of Japanese descent, refused to go to the government's internment camp. Korematsu was convicted for defying the government order. He appealed to the Supreme Court. In a 6-3 decision, the court sided with the government and ruled that the exclusion order was constitutional. Chief Justice Hugo Black and the court found that the need to protect against espionage outweighed individual rights. Another case of equal protection reached the Supreme Court in 1945, when the Shelley family purchased a house in St. Louis, Missouri. Unbeknownst to the family, there was a restrictive covenant placed on the property that placed racial restrictions on ownership. The court ruled the enforcement of a racially based restrictive covenant in a state court would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 1946, Irene Morgan boarded a bus traveling from Virginia to Maryland. She was ordered to sit in the back of the bus, as Virginia law required. Morgan argued that since it was an interstate bus, that the law didn't apply. She was arrested and fined. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP argued that the Supreme Court decision in 1877 ruled that it was illegal for a state to forbid segregation. Then, likewise, it was illegal for a state to require it. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down a Virginia law requiring racial segregation on commercial interstate buses because it violated the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. Separate but equal, the mainstay of segregation in the South, applied not only to railroad cars but to all public facilities, including public schools. Then, in 1954, in the case Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that separate schools could never be equal. They were inherently unequal. In this landmark decision, the justices unanimously ruled that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. While the ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education did not end segregation in the United States, it was a turning point in the rising civil rights movement. The 14th Amendment has been challenged in the area of sex discrimination, too. Ida Phillips claimed she was denied employment on account of sex. The company, Martin Marietta, had a policy of not accepting job applications from women with preschool-aged children. The Supreme Court decided that one hiring policy for women and another for men violated the law, particularly since both male and female applicants had preschool-aged children. Over the course of the 20th century, the 14th Amendment was interpreted more broadly. The Supreme Court came to recognize that most of the freedoms protected by the Bill of Rights extended to the states as well as the federal government,